They say blood is thicker than water. But I learned the only real blood can be the kind you never knew existed. I was 78, widowed, when a DIDNA test proved the grandson I'd raised for 7 years was a stranger. My son called it a mistake. The lawyer pressured me to sign. Then a nurse quietly closed the door behind her, and she showed me the one result that changed everything. My name is Arthur Vance. I built a fortune, left enough for a lifetime. After my wife died, the only thing I had left to protect was my legacy. My son Jeremy brought home a baby, said the mother was gone. I raised that child as my grandson for 7 years. Then a DNA test revealed no genetic link. Jeremy called it a mistake. The family lawyer pressured me to sign my wealth over to the boy. They made me out to be senile, isolated, but just when I thought I'd lost everything, a nurse quietly shut the door and handed me a truth that nobody could have predicted. I am 78 years old. My hands have built more than most men will touch in 3 lifetimes, but they shake now when I hold a glass. Dr. Henderson calls it a progressive neurological condition. I call it my body finally asking for a break after 8 decades of refusing to take one. My wife Eleanor died 6 years ago. That left me with a fortune worth just under $300 million, a home in the hills outside Nashville, and a son named Jeremy, who I thought was the one thing I'd gotten completely right. Jeremy moved into the main house after the funeral. Said he couldn't stand the thought of me rattling around alone. I was grateful. Loneliness at that age is not poetic. It's a dull ache that sits on your chest and doesn't get up. 2 months later, he brought home a baby boy. Said the mother was a woman he'd been seeing quietly, that she'd died in childbirth and he hadn't known how to tell me. I held that baby in my trembling hands, and for the first time since I'd stood at Eleanor's grave, something inside me softened. We named him Caden. I became a grandfather not by history, but by the sheer force of love. For 7 years I raised that boy. I taught him to catch a baseball in the backyard, read him bedtime stories until my voice went hoarse, attended every school concert in a suit that still smelled like the boardroom, because I'd come straight from a meeting just to sit in the front row. He called me Papa. I would have signed over my entire empire for that word alone. Jeremy managed the estate. I trusted him. He'd earned it, or so I believed. He handled the investments, brought in legal counsel, modernized the holdings. The family lawyer, a man named Gerald Pritchett, who had been with us for 15 years, oversaw everything. The 3 of us formed a tight triangle around Caden. I thought we were protecting him. I didn't see that I was the one who needed protecting. Then came last March. Caden fell off his bicycle during a visit to the park. Nothing serious, a fractured wrist, but the hospital ran a standard panel because he'd hit his head on the pavement. The pediatrician asked a routine question about family medical history. I rattled off what I knew from Jeremy's side: heart disease on Eleanor's line, diabetes from somewhere else. The doctor paused, looked at the chart, then back at me, and said something that made the entire room tilt sideways. There's an anomaly in Caden's genetic screen. Just a carrier marker, nothing dangerous, but it doesn't match what you're describing. Would you like us to run a familial DNA match to be safe? I said yes because I thought safety was the point. I signed the consent form without a second thought. That signature was the first domino in a line of dominoes that would collapse everything I knew. The results came back on a Thursday. I was in my study, looking out at the garden Eleanor had planted 30 years ago when Jeremy walked in with a manila envelope. His face was calm, almost rehearsed. He said the lab had made an error. He showed me the document. It stated unequivocally that there was 0% probability of a biological grandparent-grandchild relationship between Arthur Vance and Caden Vance. I read the line 4 times. My brain kept refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. I said the word impossible out loud, and I waited for Jeremy to panic, to get angry, to demand a retest. He didn't. He said the lab was a third-rate facility he'd found when I'd asked him to handle the test. A mix-up, he said, happens all the time. He'd already spoken to Gerald Pritchett, and Gerald agreed the document was meaningless. That was my first sign something was wrong. Jeremy had spoken to the lawyer before speaking to me. The next day, Gerald himself appeared at the house. Gerald is a man who wears his suits like armor, every crease intentional. He sat across from me at the dining table, folded his hands, and told me gently that at my age, with my condition, it was understandable to feel confused. He used that word, confused, like a diagnosis. He said the test was invalid, but what mattered now was securing Caden's future. He placed a document in front of me, a custodial trust agreement that would transfer my remaining direct holdings into a vehicle overseen by Jeremy as trustee for Caden's benefit. All routine, he said. Every responsible patriarch does this. I'd still have an allowance, still live in the house, but Jeremy would handle everything legally. He said it would protect the boy in case something happened to me. I looked at the signature line and felt my heart beat in a way it hadn't since I'd closed a hostile takeover in 1982. But something stopped me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying every moment of that conversation. My hands were shaking worse than usual. The nurse who'd been looking after me since Eleanor passed, a quiet woman in her mid-30s with steady eyes and a voice that never rushed, came in to check my vitals around 2 in the morning. Her name was Lena. She asked if I was all right. I said I was just tired. She looked at me for a long moment, then at the door, then back at me, and she said something so softly I almost didn't hear it. "Mr. Vance, I don't think that test was a mistake, and I might know a way to find out for certain." She placed a folded piece of paper on my nightstand, picked up her tray, and walked out before I could ask a single question. I opened the paper. On it was a single name and a phone number, and a note that made my blood run cold. "Don't show this to your son. Call before breakfast." I didn't sleep again that night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my hands trembling against the bedsheet in a rhythm that had nothing to do with my condition. The note was still in my palm, the ink slightly smeared from sweat. "Don't show this to your son. Call before breakfast." I kept asking myself what I'd done to make a woman I barely knew risk something like that. And the answer, which I wouldn't fully understand until later, was nothing. She wasn't risking something for what I'd done. She was risking it for what I hadn't known I'd done, decades before I ever heard her name. At 5:30 in the morning, I pushed myself upright, walked to the study, and closed the door. My fingers shook so badly I had to dial twice. The voice that answered was male, calm, unhurried, a geneticist named Dr. Samuel Cross. He had a small practice outside Knoxville and, as he explained without a trace of salesmanship, a quiet specialty in discreet familial verification. He'd been contacted already, he said, by a woman who told him I might be calling. I didn't ask how she knew him. I didn't have the energy to wonder why a nurse in my home happened to be connected to a geneticist who handled cases like mine. I just said I needed to know whether the boy I'd raised as a grandson was biologically mine. Dr. Cross told me to bring a sample from the child and one from myself. He said he could have results in 48 hours. 48 hours. That number hung in the air like a door I was about to walk through and could never walk back out of. The morning light came gray, and slow. I hid the note, hid the phone number, and sat at breakfast across from Jeremy and Caden as if nothing had changed. Caden asked if we could go fishing on Saturday. I said maybe. I couldn't taste the eggs. Jeremy talked about a trust document that needed finalizing soon, and Gerald would be coming by again tomorrow evening with the papers. He said it casually, the way you mentioned the weather. I nodded and watched his eyes. They didn't flinch. That's the thing about predators, the good ones. They don't look away at the kill because they've already reframed it in their heads as charity. The swab had to happen without Jeremy noticing. That afternoon, Lena came to give me my physical therapy exercises. While I pretended to work on grip strength, she slipped me a sterile collection kit. I didn't ask how she'd gotten it. I was past asking. She kept her voice low. Jeremy was on a conference call in his wing of the house for another hour. Caden was in the playroom. I went to him, swab in my pocket, and I said I needed to check his mouth for a loose tooth. He opened wide and held still. Children trust so completely. I twisted the swab, sealed it, and tucked it away. My hand was steadier than it had been in months. Maybe purpose does that. I drove myself to Knoxville the next morning, something I hadn't done in 2 years. Jeremy had taken Caden to school, and Gerald was at the office. I told the housekeeper I was going to a medical appointment for my tremors, which wasn't exactly a lie. The drive took 2 hours. Dr. Cross met me at a small lab tucked behind a dental supply warehouse. He was a thin man with spectacles and the kind of quiet patience you find in people who deal in life-altering information. He took my sample without ceremony, logged both specimens, and told me he'd call with the preliminary results by Friday evening at the latest. I drove home slower than I'd driven there. For the next 2 days, I functioned in a fog. Gerald came with the trust documents, and I told him I needed my personal physician to review them before I signed anything. He smiled and said of course, but his left eyelid twitched. Jeremy began hovering more, asking if I'd eaten, if I'd taken my pills, if I'd been sleeping. The concern was a costume that didn't quite fit. On Thursday night, he mentioned that Gerald had suggested I might benefit from a geriatric competency evaluation, just routine, to ensure I was making sound decisions. I said I'd consider it. I knew then they were building a cage. The evaluation was the door, and if I walked through it, I'd never make another decision about my fortune again. Friday evening came. The phone rang in my study. Dr. Cross's voice was measured, but I heard the weight in it. He said, "Mr. Vance, the results are conclusive. There is 0% probability of a grandparent-grandchild relationship between you and the minor child tested. I'm sorry to deliver this news." I thanked him and hung up. I sat in the chair that Eleanor used to sit in when she read in front of the fire, and I let the enormity of the betrayal wash over me. 7 years of bedtime stories, 7 years of baseballs and school concerts, and a little voice calling me Papa. Every single memory was still real, but the boy at the center of them wasn't my grandson. He never was. Jeremy had brought a stranger's child into my home and dressed him in my family name. I didn't cry. I went very, very still. The stillness of a man who has just had the ground ripped out from under him and is calculating exactly how far he has to fall. I had no one to turn to. Gerald was in Jeremy's pocket. The staff reported to Jeremy. My friends had faded after Eleanor died. I was a 78-year-old man with $300 million and not a single ally, except maybe one. And at that exact moment, as if she'd been waiting for the exact weight of that silence, there was a soft knock on the study door. Lena pushed it open, stepped inside, and turned to close it quietly behind her. The latch clicked. The sound was barely louder than a heartbeat, but it sealed the room. She looked at me and said, "You got the results." I nodded. "He's not your grandson." Another nod. She crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite mine. "I have something to tell you, Mr. Vance. Something you're not going to believe at first. But I have proof." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the same kind of document I'd just received from Dr. Cross. She unfolded it and placed it on the table between us. I looked down. It was a familial Dina report. At the top was her name, Lena Colson, and under a highlighted line, the results read, "Probability of grandparent-grandchild relationship, 99.98%. I stared at the number and my brain, already battered by one impossible truth, simply refused to process a second. I looked from the paper to her face, and in the silence, Lena began to speak. She told me about a woman named Margaret who had worked at a diner in Memphis 43 years ago. A woman I'd loved for one brief, secret season before I met Eleanor. A woman I'd never known was pregnant when I left. A daughter I'd never known existed, who grew up in the foster system, had a child of her own, and died of cancer when that child was 17. That child was Lena, my granddaughter. She had found me through a commercial Dina database 2 years earlier, quietly, carefully. And when she learned I was alone and aging, she applied for a nursing position with the agency that serviced my estate. She didn't come for money. She came because I was the only blood she had left. And tonight, she'd closed the door because the people who thought they were cornering a confused old man had no idea that the man wasn't alone anymore. And neither was she. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was warm and steady, and her knuckles looked exactly like Eleanor's. "They're going to try to have me declared incompetent next week," I said. Lena didn't flinch. "Then we'll make sure the world sees the truth before they get the chance," she said. Somewhere in the house, Jeremy laughed at something on his phone. He didn't know it, but the clock on his entire plan had just started ticking backward. Lena didn't leave. She stayed in Eleanor's old chair, and for the first time in 6 years, the room didn't feel like a museum. She told me about her mother, Sarah, who died in a county hospital when Lena was 17. A woman I had loved for 6 months in my 20s and never knew was pregnant. She told me about foster homes that taught her to be invisible, about putting herself through nursing school by sleeping 4 hours a night and studying in the break room at a 24-hour diner. I listened and felt something I hadn't felt since the day I'd held Caden as an infant, the stubborn, quiet pull of a reason to keep breathing. Then she leaned forward, and her voice dropped even lower. "Miss Vance, there's something else. Something I almost didn't tell you tonight because I wasn't sure you could survive hearing it." I told her I'd survived building an empire from nothing, burying my wife, and learning my grandson was a lie. I could survive a few more words. She handed me a second piece of paper. The same header, the same doctor, the same type of result. "I tested Jeremy," she said. "I took a sample from his hairbrush 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what I'd find. I just knew something was wrong in this house, and I couldn't protect you without knowing exactly what." The paper showed a 0% probability of a biological father-son relationship between Arthur Vance and Jeremy Vance. The air left my lungs. Not in a rush, but slowly. Like a tire with a nail in it. 45 years. The little boy I taught to ride a bike, the teenager I argued with over curfews, the man I'd entrusted with my company and my legacy. Not my son. Eleanor, the thought cut sideways through the numbness. I'd never suspected. Not once. The secret she must have carried, the weight of it, I'd never have the chance to ask her why or how or whether she even knew. That grief was its own separate wound, one I'd have to examine later when the battle was over. I looked at Lena. Then, I have no son. And the boy I raised as my grandson is a stranger twice over. She held my gaze. You have me. And I didn't come here to claim an inheritance. I came because you were alone and someone was circling you. I asked her what she wanted. She said the same thing I wanted, the truth in the open and the people who tried to dismantle me held accountable. I nodded. Then we do it together. The next morning, Gerald appeared at the breakfast table with a document already unfolded. He slid it across the wood like he was serving a verdict. The competency evaluation is scheduled for next Tuesday, he said. Standard procedure. The court just wants to confirm you're making sound decisions. After that, we can finalize the trust transfer and put this whole mess behind us. Jeremy nodded along, fork moving through his eggs. His performance was excellent. Concerned son, patient, steady. I looked at him and saw a stranger wearing the face of a man I diapered in a Nashville apartment, when I still worked 16-hour days building the company that would later make me rich. I said I'd be ready for the evaluation. Gerald smiled and told me not to worry. The smile was a receipt for a transaction he'd already booked in his head. The moment his car left the driveway, I called the number Lena had first given me. It wasn't just Dr. Cross. She'd also connected me to an attorney named Harriet Kane, a woman who'd spent 30 years protecting elders from exactly this kind of family fraud. We met her the following afternoon at a diner on the other side of town, a place where nobody recognized a Vance. Harriet was built like a retaining wall, short, dense, immovable. I handed her the DINA tests, the trust documents Gerald had drafted, and a timeline of everything that had happened since Caden's bike accident. She read for 12 minutes without speaking. Then she closed the file and said, "We have enough to file an emergency petition to freeze your assets and order court-supervised genetic testing of all involved parties. But to get a judge to act before Tuesday's hearing, I need incontrovertible proof of intent to defraud. Bank records, adoption records, forged signatures, any paper trail that shows this wasn't a medical mix-up, but a conspiracy." That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I drove myself to the downtown office tower where I'd built my fortune. The security guard recognized me and let me upstairs. The files I needed were in a secure cabinet only I could access. I pulled statements from the family trust, the one Jeremy managed. It took me 90 minutes to find the first irregularity, a series of wire transfers totaling over $2 million to a holding company I didn't recognize. The holding company traced back to an account in the Caymans that Gerald had opened under a subsidiary name. The signature on the authorization? A clumsy forgery of my own name, dated 6 months after my hand tremors had started, when my signature already looked different from the one they'd copied. But the real detonation came the following night. Jeremy left the house at 9 to attend a late meeting he said couldn't wait. Lena had a master key to the private wing from her nursing agency, one Jeremy had forgotten she possessed because he'd never bothered to learn anything about her. She slipped into his study while I kept watch in the hallway, my pulse tapping against my temples. She was inside for 17 minutes. When she came out, she was holding a slim leather file box that Jeremy had hidden behind a false back in his bookshelf. We opened it together in my study. Inside were the original adoption papers for Caden, dated nearly 8 years earlier, signed by Jeremy Vance as the adoptive father, showing the child had been relinquished at birth by a young woman in Chattanooga for a fee of $40,000. There were also printouts of emails between Jeremy and Gerald, stretching back almost a decade, discussing the timeline for managing the old man's decline and ensuring the estate passes without challenge. Gerald had written, "Once the competency ruling is in place, he won't be able to sign a check without your approval." The boy solidifies the generational image. Nobody questions a doting grandfather. I read that line 3 times. Then I looked at Lena. They didn't just use me. They used a child. They bought a baby and weaponized love. The thing I felt in that moment wasn't anger. Anger is loud and hot and burns itself out. This was something colder and more permanent, a frozen lake with no visible bottom. Over the next 3 days, Harriet Kane filed a sealed petition with the probate court, accompanied by sworn affidavits, bank records, and the DINA results. She argued that the planned competency evaluation was itself a tool of financial predation. The judge, a woman named Claudia Haywood, with a reputation for zero tolerance of elder abuse, granted an emergency order freezing all estate assets pending a full hearing and requiring Jeremy, Caden, and me to submit to immediate court-supervised DINA testing. Jeremy didn't know yet. The order would be served on Friday, 2 days before the evaluation he was counting on. Until then, I had to play the role they'd written for me. At dinner, I let my hand shake more than it naturally would. I paused mid-sentence, staring into space like a man searching for a word that had floated away. Gerald came by twice, and both times I asked him to repeat things he'd just said. He exchanged glances with Jeremy that they thought I couldn't see. I saw every one. Lena was dosing my medication, or rather, not dosing it. She'd swapped the capsules in my pill organizer with sugar pills the day after her confession. The fog they expected me to be in was pure theater. Behind it, my mind was a scalpel. Friday morning arrived. The sheriff's deputy knocked on the door at 8:15. I watched from the window as Jeremy answered, took the envelope, and tore it open on the front step. The document was thin, but lethal. The color drained from his face in a sequence so precise it could have been choreographed. He stormed into the house, found me in the kitchen, and for the first time in his life, he didn't bother with the mask. "What did you do?" His voice was tight, a wire about to snap. I poured myself coffee with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who had all the time in the world. "I followed your advice, son. I'm making sure everything is handled properly before anything happens to me." He stared at me, and I saw it register. The tremble in my hand was gone. The confusion was gone. I was looking at him with the same steady eyes that had stared down hostile boards and corporate raiders and a man named Victor Marsh 30 years ago. He had never seen those eyes on my face, not once. He took a half step backward like I'd drawn a weapon. Gerald called 6 minutes later. I could hear his voice through the phone from across the room, high and panicked. Jeremy kept saying "I don't know" over and over. Then Gerald arrived in person, tie askew, a thing I'd never witnessed. He started talking about legal countermoves, about delaying the testing, about discrediting the foreign bank records. I let him talk. Then I stood up, and I said, "The testing is court-ordered. It will happen on Monday, and when those results come back, Gerald, the Bar Association is going to be very interested in the advice you've been giving my son for the past decade." He turned the color of a manila envelope. The night before the DINA collection, I sat in the garden, looking at the rose bushes Eleanor had planted. Lena came out with a cup of tea and sat beside me without speaking. After a long while, I said, "Tomorrow, they swab my cheek and his cheek. And for the first time in 45 years, the law will see what biology should have told me long ago." She took my hand. "He's going to fight. He's going to say the tests are wrong, that the court order is a trick, that you're senile and manipulated." I nodded. "He'll say all of that. And then the lab will produce a number that he can't argue with. And right after that, you'll stand up and produce yours. She squeezed my fingers. I'll be there. Front row. I looked back at the house, where a light still burned in Jeremy's wing. He was probably on the phone, trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. The trap was already closed, and the only thing left was to watch it spring. Monday morning came cold and clean, the kind of November day that strips the trees bare and makes everything look sharper. A court-appointed medical technician arrived at 9, carrying a sealed collection kit and a video recorder to document chain of custody. Jeremy opened the door in a suit he'd probably ironed twice. Gerald stood behind him with a smile that looked like it had been glued on with wallpaper paste. Harriet Kane was already in the living room, sitting beside me. She'd briefed me on procedure. Everyone named in the petition would submit to a buccal swab in full view of the court monitor. Jeremy, Caden, and me. And Lena, because Harriet had filed an amended motion adding her as an intervening party with her own Dina claim. Jeremy's face when he saw Lena take her place in the lineup was something I'll carry with me forever. For 9 months she'd been invisible to him, background furniture in a white uniform. Now he stared at her as if she'd materialized from the wallpaper. "Why is the nurse being tested?" he asked, his voice clipped. Harriet didn't look up. "That will become clear at the hearing, Mr. Vance." Gerald's glued smile didn't move, but his left eye twitched twice. I'd learned to read Gerald's eyes. They were the only part of him that ever told the truth. The swabs took 4 minutes. The technician sealed each sample, labeled them, and handed the container to the court monitor, who signed a receipt that Harriet immediately photographed. Caden asked why his cheek was getting poked. Lena knelt down and told him it was for a very important science project that would help keep Papa healthy. The boy grinned and said he wanted to help. I watched Jeremy's jaw tighten. He couldn't object to that. Not in front of witnesses. The hearing was set for Thursday, 4 days away, at the Davidson County Probate Court. In the interim, I spent hours with Lena in the garden, walking slowly along the paths Eleanor had laid out in 1982. She told me about her mother Sarah, my daughter, how she'd grown up poor but proud, how she'd never spoken a hard word against the father who didn't know she existed. I told Lena about the diner in Memphis where I'd met a waitress named Margaret in the summer of 1979. A woman who laughed with her whole body and made me feel like the future was still unshaped. I left because I was afraid of settling before I'd built something. I never knew she was carrying my child when I walked away. And now, 43 years later, her granddaughter was holding my arm so I wouldn't stumble on uneven brick. Life repays you in patterns you don't see until the circle closes. Jeremy spent those 4 days trying to break me. Twice he knocked on my door at night, voice soft, saying we could still fix this privately, within the family, without lawyers. He told me Gerald was prepared to resign and leave the estate matters to a neutral party if I dropped the petition. I looked at him from my chair, Eleanor's chair, and asked, "When did you stop being my son?" He didn't have an answer. I closed the door. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a handwritten letter he'd slipped under the door, long and winding, claiming he'd been pressured by Gerald, that he'd only wanted to protect Caden, that he'd always loved me as a father. I gave the letter to Harriet without reading it twice. "He's building a defense," she said. "Desperation is a good sign." Thursday came. The courtroom was small, windowless, paneled in dark wood that had absorbed decades of family grief. I sat at the petitioner's table, Harriet to my right, Lena in the row behind me. Jeremy sat opposite with a high-priced litigator Gerald had brought in at the last minute. A man named Crosswell, who radiated expense and tried to paint the entire proceeding as a misunderstanding among loving relatives. Judge Haywood took the bench at 10 o'clock sharp. She was a woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and a resting expression that said she'd already heard every excuse the human heart could manufacture. Harriet called the forensic geneticist first, a woman from the state crime lab who had no connection to Dr. Cross. She testified that the samples were collected under proper chain of custody, uncontaminated, and that the analysis followed standard protocol with dual blind verification. Then she read the results. The probability of a biological parent-child relationship between Mr. Arthur Vance and Mr. Jeremy Vance is 0%. The probability of a biological grandparent-grandchild relationship between Mr. Arthur Vance and the minor child Caden Vance is 0%. She placed the certified report into evidence. Crosswell tried to object on chain of custody grounds, but the video recording of the collection tanked his argument before it floated. Judge Haywood overruled without even glancing at him. Jeremy's face had turned to stone. His lawyer whispered something, and Jeremy shook his head, a tiny motion. Across the aisle, I sat still. I'd known the truth for weeks, but hearing it declared aloud in a room of strangers made it a fact in the world, not just a wound inside me. Then Harriet stood again. Your Honor, the petitioner respectfully requests leave to introduce additional evidence relevant to the matter of the estate's rightful heirs. She called Lena Colson to the stand. Jeremy whipped his head toward the gallery as if he'd been stung. Lena walked to the witness box with the same steady quiet she'd carried into my study the night she closed the door. A second geneticist testified. The lab had processed a separate comparison between Arthur Vance and Lena Colson using the same court-supervised sample. The result, 99.98% probability of a grandparent-grandchild relationship. The courtroom went silent in that specific, electric way that happens when a secret becomes public. Judge Haywood removed her glasses and looked at me, then at Lena, then at Jeremy. Mr. Vance, she said to Jeremy, her tone flat, do you have any response to this evidence? Jeremy's high-priced lawyer tried to request a continuance. Denied, he tried to argue the second test was outside the scope of the original order. The judge pointed out the amended motion had been served 72 hours prior. Gerald, sitting in the back row, made a movement as if to stand, and then thought better of it. Harriet then introduced the adoption papers, the forged bank transfers, and the emails between Jeremy and Gerald. She read aloud the line, once the competency ruling is in place, he won't be able to sign a check without your approval. The boy solidifies the generational image. Nobody questions a doting grandfather. I watched Judge Haywood's expression harden line by line. When Harriet finished, the judge said, this court finds clear and convincing evidence of a coordinated attempt to defraud an elder person, to pervert the legal process for financial gain, and to exploit a minor child as an instrument of that fraud. The asset freeze is hereby made permanent pending a full criminal investigation. This transcript and all exhibits will be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office and the State Bar Association. The gavel came down, not with a slam, but with a crisp, definitive click. Jeremy was ordered to vacate the family home within 48 hours. Gerald Pritchett was temporarily suspended from practicing law pending bar inquiry. Caden was placed in temporary guardianship with a court-appointed advocate while the biological mother's records were traced. I asked Harriet to petition for visitation rights for me. I wanted the boy to know that even if the blood was a lie, the love wasn't. She said she'd file it that afternoon. As the courtroom emptied, Jeremy passed me in the aisle. He stopped, shoulders squared, face unreadable. For a moment I saw the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, not the stranger who'd tried to undo me. "You were never supposed to find out," he said, so quiet only I could hear, "about any of it." I looked at him for a long moment. "I found out what I needed to," I said. "The rest is between you and whoever raised you to think this was acceptable." He walked out into the fluorescent hallway. I didn't watch him go. That evening, alone in the house for the first time in years, I walked into Eleanor's bedroom. I hadn't opened her closet since the week after the funeral. Her clothes still hung there, lavender sachets still tucked in the pockets. I was looking for nothing in particular, just wanting to stand among her things. My hand brushed a loose board at the back of the closet, something I'd never noticed in all our decades together. It gave way, and behind it was a small wooden box, the kind a jewelry set might come in. Inside were letters. Letters from private investigators. Letters from adoption agencies. Letters Eleanor had written to herself and never shown me. She had known. From the year after I married her, she had known about Margaret, about the pregnancy, about a daughter born in Memphis in 1980. She had hired an investigator the year Jeremy turned 2, because she'd wanted to know if there was anyone out there who might come into our lives later. She found the birth record. She found a photo of the little girl who had my eyes. And she made a choice. She sealed it all away. Her diary page from that year said, "I could not bear to lose Arthur. I could not bear to share him. So I will carry this secret. And I will be the only one it punishes." She punished herself for 40 years. I had thought our marriage was seamless, but she'd carried this alone. The grief I felt in that moment wasn't betrayal, it was sorrow for the weight she'd carried and never let me help her lift. And underneath it was a strange, aching gratitude that her secrecy had kept a door closed long enough for Lena to find me on her own, when the right moment came. The last page in the box was a note addressed to me, "Arthur, if you ever find this, I ask you to forgive me. Find the child if you can. Love her for both of us. And remember that I loved you with everything I had, even the parts I could not speak." The next morning I showed Lena the box. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring in, and read every letter together. She held my hand, and I held hers. Then she said, "My whole life I wondered why my mother never had a father to give her away. Now I know. It wasn't cruelty. It was just a tangled knot that took 40 years to untie." I poured us both coffee, and we drank it in silence, the kind of silence that fills a room instead of emptying it. The legal fallout continued for months. Jeremy accepted a plea deal to avoid prison, surrendering any claim to the Vance estate in exchange for probation and community service. Gerald Pritchett was disbarred and convicted of forgery and conspiracy. He served 18 months in a minimum security facility. Caden, through hearings and social workers, was eventually placed with a kind foster family in the same county, and I visited him every Sunday. I set up a trust for his education, not because I had to, but because that boy had called me Papa for 7 years. And you don't unlearn love. I still tell him bedtime stories when I can. His head on my shoulder. My hand steadier now than it's been in a decade. And Lena moved into the house. Not as a nurse, not as staff, but as my granddaughter. She gave up nursing to study genetics full-time, with a scholarship my foundation established in her mother's name. We planted a new rose bush where Eleanor's old one had died back. On the plaque beneath it, I put 2 names, Eleanor and Sarah. 2 women I loved in different ways, whose lives curved around mine like vines growing toward the same sun, finally meeting at the end. Some men built empires to prove something. I built mine to protect something. And when the schemers finally came for it, I discovered I wasn't alone. I had a granddaughter I'd never met, a grandson I'd chosen, and a legacy that wasn't measured in dollars but in the quiet loyalty of one woman who closed a door and told me the truth. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: the people closest to you are not always the ones who share your blood. They are the ones who show up when the door is already closing. For 7 years I raised a boy I thought was my grandson. For 45 years I loved a son who was never mine. And for my entire life I believed I was the last of my line, when in truth a granddaughter had been walking toward me across decades of silence. The schemers counted on my isolation. They built their plan around a lonely old man with trembling hands and no one to fight in his corner. But they miscalculated. They didn't see Lena. And they didn't understand that a lifetime of building something teaches you to recognize when the foundation is being undermined. The lesson here is not just about greed or betrayal. It's about what you leave unexamined. I spent decades checking every contract, every balance sheet, every face that walked into my boardroom. But I never once thought to check the story I'd been told about my own family. That is the blind spot predators count on. They don't need you to be stupid. They just need you to be too trusting to look closely at the one thing you swore you'd never question. I think about Eleanor often now. I think about the weight she carried alone, the choice she made to bury a truth out of love and fear. I don't condemn her. I understand her in a way I couldn't have a year ago. Some secrets are not born of malice. They are born of a human heart trying to hold on to a happiness it believes it doesn't deserve to complicate. But secrets have a way of growing in the dark. They become leverage for someone else. The only vaccine against that is hard truth. Spoken early. Spoken fully. Even when it costs you. Lena says I should tell people the most important thing we did was get the DNA tests. I disagree. The most important thing we did was trust each other before the evidence arrived. She trusted me enough to hand me that folded paper. I trusted her enough to dial a stranger's number. That mutual trust, two people choosing to be truthful in a house full of lies, that was the pivot the whole scheme turned on. If you are in a situation where someone tells you not to worry about a strange document, not to get a second opinion, not to ask questions, start asking harder. And if you have a nurse, a neighbor, a friend who offers you a piece of truth you didn't go looking for, listen. That person may be the difference between losing everything and finding what you never knew you had. My hands still shake. Some mornings I can't button my own shirt, but my mind is clear, and my home is full of voices now. Lena is in the garden, Caden visits on Sundays, and there is laughter in rooms that were silent for 6 years. I did not get the family I expected. I got the family I fought for. And when I sit on the porch at sunset, I know with a certainty that goes deeper than any blood test, legacy is not a document you sign over. It's what you leave in the hearts of the people who choose to stay when the door is closed. If this story hit something in you, hit that subscribe button. It helps more people find these stories, and it tells us you want to hear more. And if you have your own quiet suspicion about something that doesn't add up, don't wait until the door is shut. Open it now. The truth is already on the other side. Thank you for being part of this. We'll see you in the next one.